This is Around the Farm, the podcast about all things ag, and I'm your host, Rick Myro. On today's show, it's a crowd favorite. We're going to be talking about weather for the fall. And we've got our resident expert, John Mioduszewski, who's with Bayer, or better known as Weatherman John, to talk to us about what to expect for weather this fall. John, it's great to have you back with us. Our listeners have had such great feedback about the multiple times you've been with us so far here on Around the Farm for our planning cycle, for our planting cycle, and getting ready and helping them to understand some of the concerns around weather. Really excited to have you back with us today. But for those of our listeners who might be new, haven't seen some of your previous visits before, can you go ahead and give them your background just one more time?
Yeah, it's great to be back, Rick. I'm a data scientist here at Bayer for a couple of years. Prior to that, I was a climate scientist doing research as a postdoc at Wisconsin and previously doing a PhD at Rutgers, just focusing on the Arctic and the climate change, the accelerated changes that we're seeing there. So a lot of atmosphere, snow and ice interactions. But these days I'm looking at much more of the Corn Belt, and I'm learning about agriculture and the effects of weather and even climate change on what we're seeing in the Midwest. And so what I do at Bayer is I really try to leverage my expertise in meteorology and climate science to try and isolate the effects of the environment on what we're seeing in the hybrids that we're testing in corn and soy in a whole bunch of different locations and multiple years.
Well, it's been a very interesting summer. I mean, if you think back to when we visited earlier this year, is there anything that jumps out to you that was a little bit surprising, that maybe the data wasn't suggesting was going to happen this summer, that ended up transpiring anyway?
Well, there was a lot that's happened. There hasn't been one story. It's more about where you are. I think one of the big stories was the excessive heat that a lot of the country experienced starting in June. We had some extreme and prolonged heat in mid to late June, starting in the central states and the high plains, and that gradually moved eastward through July. And into early August. But overall, it was really a very hot time period at a bad time for the crops. So in those reproductive stages of the corn, for example, is when they're particularly susceptible to extreme heat and dry conditions. And so it hit around that time, and that affected crops in a lot of the country.
Well, when you think about that, it's hard to talk about this summer and the weather that we experienced without making some reference to the Derecho. Obviously, an unprecedented weather event that really affected folks in Iowa, some of the surrounding states there. Can you talk to our listeners a little bit about what was it that caused that event, and were there any advanced warning signs that could have signaled to folks that, hey, something's coming?
As far as, what is a derecho in the first place? So it begins as a line of thunderstorms that have organized together. It moves, it begins moving and bowing out. So it's called a bow echo on the radar. And it's in that concave part of the storm system that you really get the very high winds. So by the time it got to about central Iowa, it was really at a mature state. It was doing its most damage. It was producing winds in a straight line that were similar to a tornado or even a hurricane for 40, 50, 60 miles along the line. And that continued as it moved eastward through eastern Iowa and then the entire northern half of Illinois, although it wasn't quite as bad there. So what this shows is a bunch of radar images that are taken each hour of the derecho as it moved eastward. So you're starting as it's just forming over South Dakota and Nebraska in the morning, and simply this is just reflectivity. So this is going to show these darker reds and even purples are just more intense rain and to some degree winds. So when you see it start to form in the shape of a squall line, and then it's bowing out as it in the direction that it's moving, that's when you know that that's a particularly a severe squall line. And so this is going to operate in a self-sustaining way where it has a rear inflow jet that's sucking in air from behind it and is kind of expelling air off to the sides. And in that way, it tends to sustain itself and its strength as it's moving east and bringing with it straight line winds that by definition are at least, I think, about 70 miles an hour. But in this case, it was quite a lot more than that. So this was really a remarkable event in both its severity and its the distance that it traveled.
John, when you think about this, folks are a lot more knowledgeable and hear more often things like tornadoes, even hurricanes for folks that are down in the coast. And hey, in the Midwest, a damaging thunderstorm isn't a shocking thing. But for me, this is really my first exposure to the derecho. What type of environmental things came together to prompt this particular type of severe storm?
This was not forecast very well. The forecasters were not, able to give a day or more of advance warning as they can with other storms like hurricanes and even tornadoes. They can often say, the environment was very favorable or will be very favorable in the next day or two. You have a lot of wind shear, just winds at different levels of the atmosphere are moving in different directions or at different speeds. These are things that are very conducive to tornadoes, but it's not as clear cut with something like a derecho. So in this case, there were signs that, we had some storms forming and there were going to be an organized system, but there was not really much advance warning of severe weather on this day. It was just in a low risk of severe weather for all of Iowa and Illinois. So, once it got started and started to cause some damage, they realized that this is something that can self-perpetuate, and this is a derecho or is becoming one. And, downstream, so further east in Iowa, northern Illinois, they definitely had half a day's warning that this was going to be on its way. It was probably going to be pretty severe given what was happening in Iowa. And it's the same system. But it's really, it's hard to pinpoint the exact environment that is most conducive to these storms. It's just, as I said, it feeds on this hot and humid air near the surface. That's one thing that you look for. Beyond that, it's a little bit trickier. It's never easy forecasting a derecho very far in advance.
Well, it's kind of hard to forecast anything in 2020. This has not been the normal year. A lot of the things that have transpired over the year have certainly been a little bit out of the norm for us. So, it was really a terrible, terrible weather event that happened there. Our thoughts are with a lot of the folks that were affected by that, and a lot of the crop that was affected for a number of our users out there as well. So, as we turn the page and start to look forward, and
let's not turn the page yet, though, Rick. I have a couple more. So this is a map of the estimated maximum wind gusts with the derecho, and this is Iowa, central and eastern Iowa, and so it was relatively narrow swaths that got the most damage. I mean, there was a very extensive area of 60 mile an hour winds, which will do a certain amount of damage by themselves. But then you get into just narrower mesoscale features of the derecho itself, and these limited some of the upper end winds more than 100 miles an hour. There were even reports of 120 to 140 miles an hour in the Cedar Rapids area. So that was really extreme. I mean, that's almost Category 4 hurricane or so. So really exceptional for a derecho. And then I'll share one more. because you can actually see the damage from space. I don't know if you guys saw any of the pictures that were just snapped from the cornfields, but entire cornfields were on the ground.
Yeah, I've seen some of the imagery where, you've just got a field that's been tabletopped, right? I mean, completely taken down, and not just bent, right? Snapped off as well. So really, really a devastating impact to crop.
Yeah. So this is called a visible satellite image. It's just if you were to go into space and snap a picture. And this was taken a few days later, and you can even see just by the discoloration over these same swaths of the most intense wind in the middle of Iowa. And what this is there's so much corn, of course, in Iowa. This is just some of these fields that were completely snapped and on the ground. And at this point, it's too late in the season for the corn to correct itself. If it were earlier, you get some lodging, you get the stalks get bent over, they can kind of correct themselves. But at this point, most of that is just a total loss. And some of these fields there was nothing left to harvest of them. So they are a total loss. So they think that it could be a multi-billion-dollar disaster, mostly from the agricultural losses alone. But still no real numbers yet on that.
Yeah, it was definitely an unprecedented event. That's crazy to see the impact even from space, right? You see some of the images that the folks in the area send over to you, and there's down silos, there's down bins, all kinds of things happening, and along with the damage to the crop. But that's the first time I've seen an image like that, John, that really shows the devastation from up and out of the atmosphere, and really helps you to see just how devastating those winds were for some of the swaths of the derecho there.
Yeah, and I guess the emphasis that I would make is that derechos are not that rare, especially in the Midwest and the plains. They're but I'd say with Iowa, you see somewhere in the state probably sees one or more each year. They're just not typically that severe.
Kind of par for the course in 2020, though, right? This has been the year of rare things happening, things that are a little bit unprecedented. So hopefully as we move into harvest, we won't have 2020 rear its head again. But John, as we turn our eyes towards harvest, and we're getting into the heart of it here in most of the country, what are you expecting as you start to think about and start to look at some of the data around some of the things we can expect from a weather perspective at harvest time, and how that might affect a lot of our listeners as they get the combines out in the field?
Mostly the conditions are pretty good going into harvest season. And then as far as the weather for September, October, it's looking continued cooler in September over much of the country, especially the central states, which is not a bad thing. Precipitation is a little bit more important with harvest. You definitely don't want to see any heavy rain and washouts and be able to get into the fields. It doesn't look like there's anything too problematic down the road. It's real hard to say with October, but as far as early freezes, it's really too early for that as well. But it's a good sign that a lot of farmers were planting early, especially in the upper Midwest. I was noticing that in the spring, like in Minnesota, especially Wisconsin, were getting in the fields real early, and so they should have an early harvest and be able to avoid any risk of an early frost.
After last year, everybody was in a hurry to get crop in this year, and I think that's going to pay off. I've heard from a lot of folks that I talk to out in the countryside that they've started harvest a little bit earlier this year and are a little bit further along. So that's always a good sign, considering especially where we were last year with such a late harvest, and in some areas of the country really didn't get crop out until even after the winter. Are there any warning signs, John, where we might run into a bout of precipitation or anything else that might slow down the progress to harvest? Or are you cautiously optimistic that if we've gotten started early, we might actually be able to wrap it up early as well?
Yeah, I would be optimistic. I think if everything looks good, if the fields are looking good right now, then you're almost home free. I suppose that's always the case anyway. But yeah, there's not nothing really in the cards. The only possible wild card is that it's been an extremely active tropical season, hurricane season. It's as active as anything in history thus far, and predicted to continue to be so. So that's more of an issue in some places than others. But you get storms out of the Gulf. They can bring some heavy rain up through the Mississippi Valley. You can anyone on the East Coast is obviously always keeping an eye on that in September and October. But even Iowa and all the way up the Mississippi River earlier this, I think in July, it was one of the first times they'd ever had a tropical storm or remnants of one come through. So, it's 2020, anything can happen, and you just keep a nervous eye on the tropics, even if you're 500 miles inland this year.
We're all going after 2020. Like the day we flip the calendar for 2021, all this stuff's just going to reconcile itself. I don't know if we're giving 2020 a bad rap or if we're just in a tough run here, but it does feel like anything can happen. And it's important to ground ourselves more in, what are the norms? And we talked about this at planting of, hey, are we seeing planting timeframes moving up, moving back? Are they consistent with where they've been historically? I'll ask you the same thing, John. If we throw out some of these outlier years that we've had, like this year being a little bit early, last year being a lot late, if you look at the last decade or so, are there any trends amongst harvest that say, hey, we're getting into harvest a little bit earlier, or it's happening later? Anything that jumps out to you in terms of how the normal harvest typically is going?
Well, I don't think there's been too much change, especially in a relatively short period, like 10 years. Yeah, if anything, it would be a little bit earlier, because there has been a trend toward earlier planting. So, if you're a farmer, you can either plant earlier and harvest earlier. You can try to go with a seed that's a higher relative maturity, and try to benefit off of that too, which I think is probably happening a bit more than just harvesting early, although, it's still a valid concern to worry about an early frost in some places. But climatologically, or at least as far as the climate trends, there hasn't been as much of a trend in the fall as there has been in the spring toward earlier planting dates, earlier onset of spring. So, September and October haven't really exhibited very much change, especially in the last 10 years over most of this country. A lot of these extreme events that we talk about, whether it's the Derecho or hurricane recently, these tend to impact pretty small areas, at least the worst of it does. And, it gets amplified these days by the media and so much reporting on it. And in the end, you probably never, if you were part of that Derecho, like you probably never experienced anything like that in your life, and you might not ever again. It's not like it's a trend in the local weather is getting more of these events. It's just, it was just kind of the luck of how things worked out. Overall, this growing season has been overall better than the last few, I think. So if you're looking at it in that way, it's kind of encouraging.
Well, John, it's interesting to me that you described 10 years as a relatively short amount of time. I got to tell you, from my perspective, 10 years ago, I didn't have any kids. I slept a lot more and had a lot more free time. So 10 years feels like a lifetime from my perspective, but yeah. I can understand where in the weather world, you probably want to look at a little bit more data than that to understand what those trends look like.
Yeah, I guess I didn't realize how much I compartmentalized my personal life from, looking at climate data. So, climate, 10 years is always a very short amount of time.
It took 30 years to really understand the weather trends. It took less than 10 years for me to have every single song from Moana and Frozen and can be recited on demand. So a lot can change in 10 years.
That is true.
Well, John, we've got a new segment that we'd like to introduce for Weatherman John here, and you've got many advanced degrees. You're one of the foremost experts on the climate in the entire Bayer Corporation. But now it's time to play a little game. So, John, it's time to play the Name That Cloud game. Are you ready? Are you prepared to be the first contestant on this show? Just remember, your entire credibility is on the line.
Well, I hope that's not true.
Here we go. Cloud number 1. Name that cloud, Weatherman John.
It's some type of cumulus. It's could be probably not big enough to be cumulonimbus. But yeah, I'll just say some sort of cumuliform, low, cumulus. There we go. We're not getting.
I'm pretty sure John's going to dominate this game. We were pretty basic in just calling it a cumulus cloud. You were over here throwing out additional technical terms on top of that. So let's up the game a little bit and make it a little bit more challenging. What do we have here?
Well, they call those mare's tail, I think, but just as the layperson's term. But those are a type of cirrostratus. High altitude.
He's 2 for 2, folks. His credibility is still intact as Weatherman John. Cloud number 3.
Ooh, that looks like part of a gust front. Oh, this is a good one. There are a lot of ones specific to severe weather that I should know this though. A shelf cloud we'll go with.
See, you gotta trust your gut. There it is, the shelf cloud. He's 3 for 3, folks, batting 1,000. Number 4.
This is the cirrostratus. The other one was just cirrus. I'm going to say cirrostratus. Yeah.
Listen. I mean, we can't even stump you. You say it's from 30 years ago, and you've got this thing on lockdown. Yeah. There's one last cloud that you've got to identify here to go perfect for the round, Weatherman John. Let's see if you can do it.
Those are mammatus clouds, formed from descending pockets of air. So it's basically like you're looking at the upper side of a normal cloud, whether you got your pockets of air rising, but it's coming on the backside of a strong thunderstorm. It's a beautiful cloud.
Delivered with absolute confidence here as we get later in the round. All right, are you ready for the bonus round?
Yeah, of course.
Name that cloud. It's a very rare cloud, only seen in very cold climates.
In very cold, it looks like you're looking down at the Earth from above. I don't know, Rick. It looks like some sort of a steam cloud. I don't know.
Actually, the steam isn't far off. What you're actually looking at right there is a snow monkey.
Okay. So you're looking at the top of the snow monkey's snowy head.
It looks like clouds. It's in the neighborhood. I'm actually impressed that you threw steam out there as though there was steam coming off of the snow monkey's head.
I can't say that I was too close to the snow monkey.
I'm going to give you credit for it. Hey, look at it this way. You did your professors from college proud. 5 for 5 on Name That Cloud. Weatherman John earns his keep. Well done, sir.
Thank you.
Well, Weatherman John, it's always a pleasure to have you. Don't go far, because as soon as we get out of harvest, we're going to be talking to you again about some of the conditions that we experienced this winter and how those might impact a lot of our listeners as they're starting to make preparations for the 2021 planting season. So, John, thanks again for taking the time to join us around the farm.
It's always a pleasure, Rick.
Well, as we wrap up today's episode, I want to thank all of our listeners for downloading the podcast and listening in. We appreciate you spending time with us around the farm. And if you have any support needs as you move into harvest this fall, never hesitate to reach out to the Climate Support Team. You can get them by phone at 888-924-7475 or via email at support@climate.com. And if you'd like to learn more about how you can use FieldView to stay connected in these challenging times, visit us at climate.com/stay-connected to see lots of great video and content about how you can use FieldView to stay connected through these challenging times. Hey, as always, it's been a blast, and we'll see you around the farm.